I'm John Atack, which people probably know by now, 400 videos in. And this is Kelvin Pierce. Hi, Kelvin.
Hi, John.
And we talked about your excellent book, The Sins of My Father, about your dreadful father. We talked about that. And I became interested in, what you've done since and what's important to you in your life. So I wanted to talk with you about that.
Okay.
So give me some idea.
Great. You want me to just start talking about that?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Okay. Well, I mean, my passion right now is the work that we do in Georgia, the country of Georgia in Eastern Europe. And so 27 years ago, my wife and I adopted two baby girls from Georgia. They were 3 months old. And we brought them back here and raised them. And when they were about 10 years old, a neighbor of mine who also adopted, but they adopted from Russia, worked for the New York Times, and he gave me an article about children in Georgia at that time, 10 years later, saying how the children in the orphanage system were still struggling mightily and how terrible the conditions were. And I can tell you that the conditions in Georgia when we adopted in 1996 were dreadful. Yeah. And at that time, a lot of the babies that were put into the orphanage system did not survive because they didn't have the resources to care for these children and to nourish them. So a lot of them were dying of starvation and disease, things like that. And there were not a lot of adoptions going on at that time. Matter of fact, only a handful. And so we got extraordinarily lucky to be able to successfully complete this adoption and actually get these babies out of the country and then give them the care they needed, because when we adopted them, they were not in good condition. So they needed a lot of care immediately. And 10 years later, conditions were not a whole lot better. And so I took that article and I sat down with my family at dinner that night and kind of shared it with them. And then I just started reflecting on how I felt like those two girls were probably the greatest gift I've ever received in my life. And so I just kind of made a comment like, we should do something to give back, in return for the gift that we received. And that's kind of where the idea started. And of course, immediately all the doubts started rushing through my mind, like, oh, I can't do anything. What can I do? I don't know anything. And, it took me a few months of kind of kicking it around in my mind before I was like, well, if I help just a couple of kids, then that's something. So I just started kind of meditating on it and, decided to call a friend of mine who was an attorney, and he helped me set up a proper legal 501c3 charity in the United States, which means it's, tax-free. I don't have to pay taxes on the donations and stuff because it was a legitimate charity.
Yeah. What was the charity called?
The IRS, or the Internal Revenue Service designation, is called 501c3.
I'm sorry, the name of the charity itself.
Divine Child Foundation.
Divine Child Foundation.
Divine Child Foundation. And so, we first really came together in around 2005. And then, kind of developed a board of directors and then started trying to make some contacts in Georgia. And then once we felt like we were ready to actually do something, my wife and I traveled to Georgia in January of 2007. And so what we did was we decided to travel all over the country and visit all the different orphanages that we could find. And so we spent 2 weeks just, with an interpreter and a driver, and just crisscrossed the country. And we would just go into the orphanage system and ask to speak to the director, and then sit down with the director and tell them what we wanted to do. And some of the directors were like, yeah, we really need help. And some of them they seemed like the ones that were still from the Soviet era of mentality were like, we don't need anything. We're just fine. And we don't need your help. Thank you very much. And before we left on that trip, my wife and my two daughters bought hundreds of pounds of fleece material, and we made like 400 or 500 scarves, and we brought them with us. So at each orphanage we visited, we gave every kid a scarf. And then at the end of that 2 weeks, you know, my wife and I and our interpreter and our driver, we had a vote on which one orphanage do we think we would be best suited to help. And it was a unanimous decision. And it was an orphanage in Sagaramo, Georgia, which was about, you know, a half an hour outside of the capital city of Tbilisi. And it was, you know, it was an old Soviet era school building, and it was being used as an orphanage. The building had like 98 windows, and only 2 or 3 of them were left intact. And the heating system had been completely ripped out of the building. All the metal parts were ripped out. As soon as the Soviet Union collapsed and Georgia became an independent country, they had no economy. So, you know, locals would go and scavenge anything that they could to try to survive. So this building was basically a shell. And, you know, there was no running water. There was a little bit of electricity, but it was in horrible condition. And the kids were, well, it's hard to describe the kids, but, you know, they really spoke to us, you know, and it really touched our heart. So we decided we wanted to start working with that orphanage. And we came back and we started raising money. And then we started communicating with the director and trying to determine what their initial needs were. You know, the first thing that we decided we could do was, you know, we bought a bunch of mattresses and blankets, and we bought like 10 bicycles for the kids to share so that they could get some, you know, outdoor activity and stuff. And then later that year, you know, I own a construction company with my wife. We do design, build, residential remodeling. I was with one of my clients, and we were getting ready to do a major addition on his house. And he asked me about, you know, what I like to do in my spare time. He's a really friendly guy. And I told him about this orphanage, and he immediately became interested and said, I want to join you and I want to help you. And he made a large donation. And then he said, next time you go back to Georgia, I'm going with you. And so we went back in November of that year. And he said, I'm going to rebuild the entire electrical system for this building. Because the guy's, you know, he knew construction. He was like an electrical engineer, really smart, really, he's like a problem solver. His name is Gilbert Julian. And so he became a prime partner for the Divine Child Foundation. And so I've been there maybe 40 times in the last 15 years. And I think Gil's been there more than I have. That's how much he really, you know, took heart for this. And we basically rebuilt that entire building. He did the entire electrical system, but we replaced every window, every door. We fixed the roof. We put a heating system in. We put in, you know, flush toilets and running water and new beds and, you know, armoires for, and backpacks and books and school supplies and toothbrushes and toothpaste, all that sort of stuff. Just basically transformed that orphanage. It had about 50 kids. And over the years, while we were doing this, we saw these, you know, ragtag bunch of kids basically coalesce into a family. And, you know, some of these kids, when I first met them, were 5, 6 years old, 7 years old. And now, you know, I keep in touch with the majority of them still. You know, some of them now are married and have children and have, you know, successful families. You know, some of the boys went into the military and did their service, and then they've come out and gotten jobs. And, you know, I'm in touch with them almost on a daily basis through Facebook Messenger. They're constantly reaching out to me. And so, you know, after Sagaramo, what happened is that the US government and the European Union started working with Georgia, trying to advise them on what things they needed to do to get more westernized and get ready to maybe become part of the European Union.
Yeah.
And one set of advice that they got was they needed to deinstitutionalize their children, the orphanage system. So with help from USAID, they basically came up with an entire new orphanage system for the country. And it's basically based on family style children's homes.
Mm.
So USAID basically went out into the country and purchased large residential houses and then remodeled them into children's homes, where each home would hold 10 children. And then they would each have like 3 or 4 nannies, or, people that would live in the house with them and raise these children like a family unit. And so the Georgian government, because of our work with them for several years, asked us if we would be willing to take on a couple of these houses. And we said, certainly. And they required us to sign a 10-year contract with them, where we would be basically 100% responsible for administering to these houses and taking care of these kids. And we told them what we would do this if, most of the kids that were still at Sagarama would be transferred into some of our houses so that we could keep continuity with them.
Mm.
And they agreed. And so we took on 2 houses. We took one in a village of Galavani and another one in a village of Silkani. And then after about a year, the Georgian government came to us and said, there's another organization that took on 2 houses and they went bankrupt. Would you take over these 2 houses as well? And we said, well, we're not sure. We can handle 2 more, but we kind of talked about it and decided to go ahead and do that. And that was in Tbilisi. We call it Bijanishvili Street. And in another village just out of Tbilisi called Gildani. So then we had 4 houses, and we were, taking care of all 4 houses. And then a couple of years later, the Georgian government came to us and said, we'd really like to start deinstitutionalizing our severely disabled children. These are children that were born with like cerebral palsy or, spine issues where they can't walk, or, have very severe mental and physical disabilities.
Mm.
And I was like, no, absolutely will not do that. I had a phobia about that. And I was just like, we don't know how we can possibly take on something like that.
Mm.
But our director, who was the director of the Sagarama home when they closed it down, so we hired her as our director for all of Divine Child work in Georgia. And she's a trained child psychologist. And she's like, Kelvin, Gil, we can do this. Absolutely, we can do this. And I'm like, nope, absolutely not going to do this. And she kept saying, we can do this, we can do this. And finally, I was like, okay, Lolly, you've done everything else you said you can do. If you really want to try this. And I was really scared. And a Georgian contractor donated a brand new house. He built it specifically for these kids to take them out of a big institution and put them in this house. And it has, a huge ratio of nannies to the children because, there's like 7 children and there's like 10 or 12 nannies there.
Yeah.
Because these kids, they have to be carried everywhere, all that sort of stuff. And I was there the very first day when they brought these kids in. And I was really nervous. And because, like I said, I had this like phobia about this. I don't know why, but I did. And I watched, the kids being carried out of the van and brought into the house. And I just kind of stood back and watched the whole thing. And then after about an hour, some of the kids were on the floor in the playroom, and they could maybe move on their elbows or something, but like paralyzed from the waist down, things like that. And I just decided to go and sit down on the floor with a couple of these kids. And I started playing with them. One of the kids I found out loved music so much. He couldn't talk or anything, but so I picked up my phone and I turned Bruno Mars on my phone. And she just started rocking back and forth. She kept reaching for my phone, and she reached for my phone and she put it up to her head. It was going like this. And it was just like, I was just transformed. And now it's my favorite house. That's where I love to be, at that house and to interact with those kids, because they're just, there's no filters, and it's an incredible experience. Um, and then the other thing, and again, this is Lolly, our director, was doing some research and found out that there was a grant available to try to open a brand new program up in Georgia, which is basically at-risk youth that are heading toward the criminal justice system, and try to give them therapy and training and vocational training to hopefully redirect them out of the juvenile justice system. And it's called the Compass Center. And we got the grant from the Swiss government. And that was opened up like 3 or 4 years ago. It's like 4 years ago. And so some of the children come from the government. Instead of being put in jail, they bring them to us and we try to rehabilitate them. So we have a staff of trained licensed psychologists, and we also have a staff of vocational trainers, and we even have a carpentry workshop, and try to train some of these kids to use their hands and be creative and be able to get a job in construction, which is booming in Georgia. But some of the kids actually come from their parents, because their parents see where their kids are headed and they're desperate, and so they'll bring their kids to the Compass Center, and it's become an invaluable resource in Georgia right now. So that's pretty much what we're doing. And so I go there about 3 times a year, and most of the time Gil comes with me, or we overlap, and sometimes he goes on his own, sometimes I go on my own, depending on what our work schedules are. But Lolly, she's our director. She's the one that's the main force. She does all the hiring of staff and the training and the administration, and making sure all the kids have everything that they need. And she just works crazy hard, and she's just phenomenal. So, and for me, it's just it just feels so good. It's just so rewarding to feel like I have 200 kids in Georgia, and half of our work now is beyond these houses, because the Georgian government, regardless of what we say that once these kids reach the age of 18 or they graduate from high school, they have to leave these houses, and they're not allowed to be in there anymore. And there's no place for them to go. So, we're not going to let these kids fall through the cracks, because they literally have become like our children. So I would say half of our work is, helping them bridge the transition from the houses into, responsible life where they can take care of themselves. So we do that through, getting them ready. Like as they're getting older, we, bring in tutors to teach them like English, or if they feel like that they want to try to go to the university, we have an agreement with the Georgian government that if they can pass the university entrance exams, then they can get free tuition. Not a lot of the kids feel compelled to do that, but a lot of them want vocational training, like in cosmetology or auto mechanics or construction. And so we will pay for that kind of training. If they want the tutoring to try to pass the entrance exams, we'll pay for that tutoring as well. We'll make sure they have whatever resources they need, like school books or tutors, or transportation to go to classes for vocational training if need be. And then, if they need a little help after they leave the house, sometimes we'll, help them pay rent for a few months until they can get a job. Or, some of them might need, like one of our kids, had a child, and her husband, was in the military, and they just didn't have enough money to keep it going for a while. So we stepped in and, helped them for 3 or 4 months until they were able to get their feet on the ground. And, whenever they're in trouble, they reach out to us. And so, yeah, I'd say half of our work is just making sure that they get well established and don't fall through the cracks once they leave the house.
What an incredible story. What a
Yeah.
wonderful story.
Yeah, it's been an incredible experience for me, for sure.
Yeah, and yeah, to do something so positive in the world. Um,
Yeah, and it's a healing thing for me too.
mm,
Um, incredibly, because and I didn't expect this at all, but based on my book, what kind of trauma I suffered, and one of the biggest effects of that trauma was my self-esteem
mm,
and the way I felt about myself,
mm,
and the way I would take things personally, rejection and stuff like that. So when I first started going to the Sagaramo house, there were a lot of kids there that were angry and were really sad, because they had been given up by their parents. A lot of these kids had parents, but the parents couldn't or would not take care of them. And so the government had to step in to make sure these kids, had a chance at life. And so when I first got there, I said, "Oh, everything's going to be great. These kids are going to be so happy to see me and stuff." And the kids would glare at you and they wouldn't make eye contact with you. And I'd be like, "Oh no, what's wrong with me?" And then I was like,
mm.
"Oh, wait, this isn't about me.
Yeah.
This is about these kids and what they've been through." So I was just like, okay, it's my mission that I'm going to not take anything personally. And I'm just going to look at these kids and I'm going to smile at them. And I'm just going to make sure, no matter what it takes, that they know that there's one person on this planet that loves them,
Mm,
regardless of where they came from, what they look like, how they acted. And one by one, those barriers came down.
mm.
And it just, love really works miracles. It really does.
Yeah, and I mean, we've come away from a really harsh history as human beings, that tyrannical and awful. 150 years ago in the West, 4-year-old children were being sent up chimneys and down mines, and they're I think that's the gradual transformation that has happened, and really a lot of it in our generation, the change of attitude that children should be seen and not heard. And I mean, I had a German friend who was a couple of years older than me, and he would have to stand to eat his food at table because that was the traditional thing in Germany, that children were this sort of lesser order of being. And seeing, when I was a kid, um, we'd still be beaten at school. That was still part of what happened. And
Yep.
seeing the attitude change, and seeing the change in society. I mean, we in the West, we have a tremendous amount of entitled children who haven't. I would really like to have been able to send my 4 children to Georgia for a few weeks to have a look, but I couldn't afford to do that. So, but
Yeah.
I think, getting our kids to understand, the tremendous benefits of our existence, and to understand that's not true for 2/3 of the world. That
John, that is a perfect. Yeah. You know why? Because, both my daughters, really didn't know a lot. I mean, we told them from the first time they could understand that they were adopted,
mm,
but they didn't really understand. So when they were 17 years old, I took them both to Georgia for the first time and I introduced them to their birth families. And for one of my daughters, especially, who was like, "I hate Georgia. I don't want to have anything to do with Georgia. I don't want to be connected with Georgia. Georgia's a puny little country. I'm part of the United States, blah, blah, blah." And I was like, "Well, I'm going to go to Georgia and your sister's going to go. Are you going to come?" She's like, "No, I'm not going to come. I'm not going to." I'm like, "Why?" She goes, "Well, the food's going to be terrible and I'm going to miss my bed and I'm going to miss my cats. So I'm not going to go." And then, once I started buying tickets, she's like, "I want to go." And I tell you what, I saw that girl age 5 years in the 2 weeks we were in Georgia. When she saw the conditions that her mother and her half sister and half brother and her grandfather and grandmother lived in, it changed her entire outlook on the world. And it was just an amazing transformation to witness and to hear what she said about it.
mm.
It was incredible. It really was.
Yeah. I mean, there was a juvenile detention center, and I keep forgetting the name of it. I have written about it, and I keep forgetting the name of it. And they decided to conduct an experiment where they would, rather than having the normal strict kind of boot camp rules, they would take a group of the children who were all juvenile offenders, and they would treat them in a therapeutic and positive and loving and supportive way. And the reoffence rate for that group was trivial compared to the reoffence rate for the other group. And if we just look at what that means in our society, the harsh treatment that's meted out, there was there's a reform school here in the early 1970s called Pepper Harrow, and they made a documentary was made about it. And they came back 20 years later, and our system changed completely. A man called William Whitelaw changed the system under Margaret Thatcher and introduced what he called the short, sharp shock, which is, of course, a quotation from The Mikado by Gilbert and Sullivan and means execution. But he thought it was funny to apply this as a way of, children it'd be boot camp. They'd be forced through. Now, the reoffence rate from those centres went up to 80%, where Pepper Harrow, I think, was below 10%, because the kids were treated as part of a family. This notion of having relationship, not being an isolated little island with their own feelings. And when they came back and interviewed the kids who'd gone there were 6 kids who'd been in the original documentary. One of them had died. One of them didn't want to be involved. But the other 4 had gone through, they'd become responsible citizens. They took part in life. And one in particular, he was 14 when they first filmed. And he was the oldest of 4 children. His mother had had children with 4 different fathers. None of the fathers had contributed to their upkeep. And he was caught stealing because he was trying to find food for his siblings. At age 14, when they interviewed him, he was illiterate. And when they came back 20 years later, he managed to get a degree, qualified in social services, and was now helping to run care homes. So,
wow. Yeah.
We need to be cared for. And
we do. Yeah. And, I think people view other people and treat other people based on the way they feel about themselves. So if you make somebody feel like they're bad and they're worthless and they're no good, then that's how they're going to treat other people. So like you said, you raise them lovingly and to, learn to, feel good about themselves, they're much more likely not to treat other people badly and to do things like that. So yeah, definitely.
I'm sure of it. And I mean, there's, even at the far extreme, there's a man called, a neurologist called James Fallon, who he had, he wanted to see if anybody in his family was showing any signs of brain disorder, Alzheimer's or anything like that. So they took 10 CAT scans and they randomized them. And he went to his assistant and he said, this one here, we have, the deficiency in the paralimbic system that is associated with psychopathy, where there is less connection between the instinctual reactive part of the brain, the limbus, the old brain, with the prefrontal cortex, the thinking part. And he said, which member of the family is this? And the assistant went, it's you, Jim. And he realized all of his life, and he was running 2 biotech companies as well. All of his life, he believed that everything was genetic, that you can forget about nurture, you're just born a certain way. And he realized that his mother, by the time he was 2, had realized there was something nasty about him. There was something unpleasant in his behavior. And so he had been very patiently looked after. And he came forward with the idea of the pro-social sociopath, somebody who, despite having been born, and his mother, I think, told him that he was actually related, I think, to 9 murderers.
Oh my God.
Including Lizzie Borden, who may or may not have actually murdered anybody. But So he found that genetically he had alleles that are associated with psychopathy. He got everything going. And with him, it meant that he will prank people. And as he says, if he's going to a funeral and he's invited to a party, he'll go to the party. He talks about taking his brother on holiday to Kenya, to the Marburg caves. And it was only when his brother got home and looked up Marburg that he realized that was where Marburg Ebola came from. So there still has all of these tendencies, but because he was nurtured, because he was cared for, he's done something positive with his life. So it shows that is important.
Absolutely. Yeah, I don't believe at all that we're completely a product of our genes or DNA. I think that our environment, and of course our choices, is really what makes us who we are.
Yeah, I think the choice is an element. I mean, I grew up where the nature nurture argument was still going on. I think it's fairly reconciled now that both things are important. But it seemed to me, but there's also who we become and the choices we make and the decisions we make. And
exactly.
More recent work in genetics, adding epigenetics and cultural transmission, that genes are not, as Richard Dawkins thinks, just this read-only thing that is passed on. They're actually written on in every generation. And so the way we behave will affect our DNA, that what we believe will affect our DNA. And you can have a grandchild who has, is obese because the grandparent ate too much. And there's been a genetic modification, an epigenetic modification that's occurred. And the evidence for this is now very good, and younger biologists have pretty much accepted it. And it gives me hope, because before that, there was this kind of fixed idea of, you're born a certain way. Jungian psychology, the idea is you're born with this is the way you'll be. And we now know from longitudinal studies that people transform tremendously during their lifetime. You're born with a temperament and you develop a character, and become somebody. In reading your book and talking with you that first time, I was very touched by the thought that somebody could survive. I mean, your mother seems to have been a lovely, decent person, but your father was a monster, absolute monster. And the thought that you could come through that and mature and develop a self and develop compassion, despite having been mistreated and abused by this awful man so badly, I think is hopeful for anybody, that that transformation can happen.
Yeah. I mean, it could have gone the other way for sure. I mean, for me, truly the most important thing for me was learning about nature of thoughts, because the thoughts were just tormenting me, and I thought that that's who you were. And I was just very fortunate to stumble upon an incredible counselor that was like, these are unhealthy mindsets, 100% unhealthy mindsets, and you do have the choice to let go of them and replace them with healthy ones. If it wasn't for her, I'm not sure I would have been able to make that transformation.
And what a transformation it's been, to now have 200 children that you're caring for. What a remarkable thing. And how do you see the future in Georgia? How do things look?
Well, I'm concerned because there's been a pretty dramatic change in the last year, because a good portion of our funding came from foreign governments, like the Swiss government, the Polish government, Turkish government. They would help. The U.S. government, the military sometimes, and USAID would help. But once the war started in Ukraine, that funding is all dried up, because that funding is being redirected toward, Ukrainian refugees and, trying to supply and care for, everybody in Ukraine that's been devastated by this war. And, that's one part. The second part is several 100,000 Russians have escaped from their country to, get out of the war, possibly be conscripted, and they've come to Georgia and and all the other countries. But, Georgia's a small country. I mean, 3.8 million people for the entire country. And you add 300,000 Russians in a few months, and 99% of them are in the capital city of Tbilisi. What do you think that's going to do to the cost of housing? What's happening is, the local Georgian population, a lot of them had jobs and were renting their homes and were doing okay. They weren't doing great, but they were doing okay. And then the Russians come in and they go to these landlords and say, I'll pay you twice or I'll pay you triple. What are the landlords going to do? They're going to go to the tenant and say, I'm sorry, but I can get twice as much or 3 times as much. You have to leave. Yeah. And the local Georgians, they don't have twice as much or 3 times as much. So they're losing their homes. And the cost of housing has gone way up. And then, of course, everything else, is being affected by inflation. And so it's really hurting us. It's hurting our foundation. It's hurting our kids. And it's hurting a lot of local, friends of mine that I know and have been friends with for years in Georgia. It's, I'm really concerned about, the future.
Yeah, absolutely.
Our ability to keep doing what we're doing.
So, you probably need to rely more upon individual donations, upon people coming to you and giving something to your charity to help.
Probably the biggest supporter I have right now is the Rotary Club. I've been a member of the Vienna Rotary Club in Virginia for 15 years now, and they support me tremendously. Yeah. And, a lot of my fellow Rotarians also support, the Divine Child Foundation. And of course, friends and family. And that's what we're surviving on right now is that, but still our budget is tiny, compared to what I would like it to be, because I would love to be able to, help way more than we're helping right now. But, that's probably my biggest weakness as, chairman of this foundation is fundraising. It's just not something that I'm good at. So, that's definitely a concern for sure.
Okay. Well, if there's anybody watching this who has something to give, or indeed understands fundraising and wants to become involved with fundraising, that would be fantastic.
I would love any help that anybody has to offer.
And I mean, Georgia is because of the whole of the Soviet Union and the Warsaw Pact countries became a foreign, strange place, and we know so little about them. Little odd factoids that Stalin, of course, came from Ossetia in Georgia. And
I have visited his birth home in Georgia, or where he grew up. And I mean, Georgia has a history that's thousands of years old, and it's a beautiful country. It's a very diverse country. And Tbilisi is an incredible city. It really is. And, before the pandemic, tourism was really starting to take off in Georgia. And it's starting to recover now somewhat. But it's an incredibly beautiful, diverse country, and the people are very welcoming. And I mean, one of their traditions is the supra, which is their traditional feast, for guests, where they sit down at this table with all this incredibly wonderful food. And they have a tamata, it's a toastmaster, and he's constantly making toast to the guest, and the history of Georgia and families and all that sort of stuff is really cool.
You also have a a long history of winemaking in that part of the world. That was where all of the great wine that was drunk by the Politburo probably came
Yes.
from.
Yes. I think they've been making wine for like 7,000 years, something like that. And they still make really good wine. And their food is incredible too. And you know, the old monasteries and churches and stuff like that that they have are just incredible. And it's a very mountainous country, but they also, you know, border on the Black Sea.
Yeah.
So they do have a semi-tropical region where a lot of tea and citrus and, you know, the grapes for the wine and stuff is grown. So yeah, I mean, when they were part of the Soviet Union, you know, they did wine and they did tea and citrus and they did, you know, vacation. It was a very popular vacation place for, you know, people from the Kremlin, you know, things like that, you know, skiing and on the Black Sea coast. So when the Soviet Union collapsed, they didn't have, you know, an industrial system or anything to fall back on. So the country economically was devastated. And then they almost immediately went into a civil war, you know, where factions were trying to fight for control. And then, of course, there was that war in the other section of Georgia, Abkhazia. And so, yeah, it was a pretty rough time in the early 90s, right after the wall came down. And so when I got there the first time in early 1996, there was electricity on maybe an hour a day. And, you know, the water was not safe to drink and it was freezing cold. And, you know, most people didn't have heat. The roads were in horrible condition and, you know, huge potholes that contained burned out cars and stuff like that. I mean, it was just really, really bad. So they have come a really, really long way in the last, you know, 25, 30 years. It's a very different country now. But, you know, once you leave Tbilisi or, you know, Batumi on the Black Sea, you get into rural Georgia, they're still very poor, you know, and they're surviving on subsistence.
Yeah. Well, let's hope that the Ukrainian war ends and some kind of stability can return to that region.
I sure hope so. You know, and then there was that war in 2008 with Georgia and Russia that only lasted a short period of time. But the Georgians don't forget that. And so there's a really nervous energy, of course, with all these Russians, you know, in Georgia. You know, some Georgians are wondering, you know, is Putin sending some of these people here for what reasons? You know, people just don't know, and they're nervous, and they're nervous about their future.
Understandably. I mean, one of the things that's interested me is the influence of neo-traditionalism, PanSlavism in that part of the world. And we're all pretty much aware of the pan-Germanic ideas that led to Hitler and Nazism. But Pan-Slavism rose up at about the same time, around about 1900, and is still a strong undercurrent in that part of the world. So that you have people like Alexander Dugin, who is a ridiculous man when you read what he has to say, and you know he's just crazy. But I read through one of his books trying to understand what this idea is, and he's an advisor to Putin. He's somebody who's basically saying we want to return to the values of medieval Russia. We want a peasant class again. We want to go back to the time of the man we call Ivan the Terrible, they call Ivan the Awesome. It depends how you take that word. And that they want a hierarchical society with, you know, a feudal society. They want to bring back serfdom. And this is written into the current Russian administration. And so Georgia is seen as a satellite state that they, you know, thankfully failed to retake back in 2008. And Dugin was involved in that. Dugin was actually there at the front with the Russian troops, which for me is, you know, my area of work is belief, and that it would appear that Voltaire didn't actually say that people who believe absurdities will commit atrocities. He said something very like it. And the second Indian Prime Minister, Radhakrishnan, did say exactly that. People who believe absurdities will commit atrocities. And we see people swayed by, PanSlavism, the idea, or Pan-Germanism, the idea that there are Aryans or people who belong to some separate part of the human race, which of course drove your father.
Yes, indeed.
And, George Lincoln Rockwell, who he admired so deeply, the founder of the American Nazi Party. And these ideas are ridiculous. They have no basis in reality. There is only one human race of various different shapes, sizes, and colors. But this trying to separate people off into nations, into peoples, and nationalism becoming a popularism, becoming a way of fighting wars with others. Yeah. Because I sense people haven't matured, they haven't grown up, they haven't understood that the survival of the human race depends upon the unity of the human race. It depends upon us working together and caring about each other, rather than wasting our time fighting wars and squabbling and all of this stuff, which is very much takes the idea of the individual being treated with care and says, well, we should have a caring society. I was in Washington, D.C. 30 years ago, and had a ride with a Ghanaian cab driver. And so I said to him, how long have you been here? He said 8 years. And I said, what's the main difference between the US and Ghana? He said, well, at home, if anything went wrong, everybody in the village would be there to help you. And in the US, we have welfare. And that really spoke. That was a really significant thought, that we have to be careful that we're making a society that cares and not trying to hand off compassion to the state, because the state is not capable of feeling compassion.
That's right.
And so it requires people, such as you, your wife, and your partner there, to actually, inject something into the society to create hope and create a future. So, yeah. Well, and why is it called the Divine Child Foundation? Where did that come from?
I don't know. I mean, I just sat down one night and just started meditating. And so what should I call this? And that just popped into my head. And so it's basically that each child is divine. It's not religious, it's more spiritual. For me, that my belief system at that time and still is that I believe we're all connected to each other in some way. And that, again, like I said, we treat other people the way we treat ourselves, and we see other people the way we see ourselves. So, if you see yourself as divine, then you see other people as divine, and then you feel like we're all part of one, for me, like one grand consciousness. And so that's what it means to me, Divine Child Foundation, that each child is divine. I believe that our children and our diversity are our greatest gifts that we have, because how boring would life be without diversity, and the gifts that our children give us as we raise them and we experience them. And I mean, that's what it just means everything to me.
Oh, I think those are tremendously worthwhile ideas, and I agree with them wholeheartedly. The idea of separating out cultures or maintaining cultural purity, to me, is like breeding dogs. That
Yes.
Ultimately you're going to end up with dogs like, the King Charles Spaniel. The brain case is too small because you've inbred that far. And so I remember watching a film about one of the variants of the Ku Klux Klan in the US, and they were having a meeting. And there's this little 4-year-old child going, white power, white power. And he's sort of, oh, really? Brainwashing.
Yeah. Well, when I was a little kid, I snuck into my dad's home office and found a white power button on his desk, and I snuck it out of his office and pinned it to my jacket. I was in the 5th grade when I did that. I didn't know what it meant,
Mm,
but I thought it was cool. And
mm.
there were some people at my school that weren't very impressed by that.
Oddly enough. Oh, dear.
Yeah.
Oh, well, it's been a great pleasure talking. I'd like to come back in a few months' time and catch up. And
Absolutely. Yeah. And is it okay if I just let people know my website address for Divine Child?
please do, yes.
So it's divinechildfoundation.org.
Mm. And please go and have a look at that, and whatever support you can offer. And if anybody has any ideas of where funding might come from, this is a truly worthy cause. And so anything we can do to help would be wonderful.
Thank you, John.
Great. Thanks so much, Kelvin.
My pleasure. It's great
We'll
seeing
talk
you
again.
again.
Yeah, likewise.
All right. You take care, sir.
Yep. Hi, John here. Thanks for watching. We'd appreciate it very much if you would click like, as well as subscribe, and click the bell for notifications. Every dollar helps, and we welcome new patrons on Patreon, or you can make a one-off payment with any currency through PayPal. Thanks so much.